Enjoy the show? Consider checking out the Lost Sun Society Patreon, which has all the episodes ad-free forever and much more to come in the future. Go to patreon.com/Lost Sun Society or check out the link in the description. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to the Lost Sun Society. Episode 1, The Atomic Empire. Were our pre-war ancestors always on the path to war? The question of who is at fault for the apocalypse is a massive question, and one that some of my colleagues have devoted their lives to. Given how much time I have, and how expensive good quality recording tape is, I think it's best that I try to summarise rather than explain in totality. So, today's tape will focus more on the question of what the pre-war world was. I want to lay out an outline for you so as to explain why the survivors acted the way they did. I think you can only really understand their mindsets if you first understand what exactly they had lost. And it was a lot. Now, most of my notes here are taken from the single most comprehensive source of the pre-war Isles, which is Elaine Withram-Locksley's An Atomic Crown, The Rise and Fall of the United Kingdom. Locksley was, and so far remains, the foremost expert on this pre-war period, and there's no better authority on this matter. Though if you decide to put this tape down and brush up on his work, I will offer fair warning that even the most charitable fan of Locksley describes his writing as obtuse. If that is not enough for you, I can also recommend his follow-up, A Queen Most Human, about the last great queen of the Isles. If you couldn't tell by the title, it was a really controversial release, and it did end up being banned in several states. However, if you can get a copy, it is a delicious read, absolutely phenomenal stuff. I'm going to skip over a lot of the essentials and assume that you know the basics. The United Kingdom, which was colloquially referred to by its inhabitants as the UK, was born out of a political union between two rival crowns some 400 years prior to the 21st century. It had navigated, occasionally fallen, but mostly survived those 4 centuries thanks to a combination of both good circumstance, careful diplomacy, and abject brutality to its fellow nation-states. At this point, depending on where you received your education, you might have learnt that the United Kingdom by the 2000s was either a modern utopia upon Earth or a degenerate and permissive techno-state. You will be disappointed to learn that it was neither. By the 21st century, the United Kingdom had entered what Locksley refers to as its sunset years. Having enjoyed a prolonged period as a global power, it slipped into a fading relevance. Many of its key decisions and institutions were outsourced to larger powers, and its legislature had slipped into a form of paralysis. Cultural output from this time points to a sense of overwhelming quagmire, a sluggishness that meant even simple solutions to ordinary problems were delayed and delayed and delayed. Much larger than a political crisis, Locksley suggests that this had seeped into a wider sense of cultural soul-searching. What was the point of everything that had been built? Who was really benefiting from the current situation? We now know this as the rotten system, and I will dissect what that means in just a second. Because, whilst it had formed an acute sense of dispossession amongst many living at the time, we can still get the sense that the inhabitants of the Isles enjoyed access to a level of luxury that can only be marvelled at. One that was built on the basis of everything being cheap, accessible from your fingertips, and available on any day at any time. As we understand it, and I really must stress that our understanding in some places is patchy at best, the citizens of the 21st century United Kingdom had sacrificed a great deal of personal and communal privileges to maintain this luxury, and so demanded that it be maintained. Woe befall any government who was on the receiving end of a price shift, for they were almost certainly doomed. Maintaining this level of luxury required a truly vast web of international trade, and an almost ceaseless process of extraction, refinement, and exportation. Some of the largest upheavals in the history of the global era came from the most innocuous of places. Ships delayed by a few weeks, a shortage of one resource causing hiccups in production elsewhere, those kind of things. Because despite the aforementioned webs of trade, there was a cultural tendency towards excess that means things just did not last, and they were not fairly distributed either. Fertile, untainted soil was practically endless, and it produced enough food to feed the world over. Yet mountains of this food was just left to spoil. Food, clothing, housing, all of these could be made widely available with a relative amount of ease. But as always, anyone who tried to champion these changes was either delayed, derided, or disregarded. It has been observed numerous times that our ancestors certainly were intelligent, but the truth is also that their institutions of universal education had been suffering greatly since their heyday in the post-war period. Though education was freely available, it had been cut to the bone by the numerous attempts at austerity, or just by sheer neglect. A result of this was that the vast majority of the population existed outside of any of the political spheres of the day, and had not meaningfully interacted with them for most of their lives. Politics was something that operated beyond them, in places they could not access, with people they could never talk to. Now, this is not to suggest that they couldn't get involved, but many of them just chose not to. In essence, the high living standard afforded by the system which they lived in meant that you could comfortably afford to ignore politics, or at least only engage in it sporadically. When most parts of your life were, all things considered, fairly comfortable, then the occasional pains of the system could be put up with. It feels funny these days to classify any of the people living in the country at the time as poor, but yes, I have to remind people that food deprivation, poverty, and homelessness all existed at that point. Opposite the majority of people who just weren't paying attention to politics were those who were effectively politically enfranchised. The most obvious of these are the political class, referring to the members elected to Parliament or the web of contractors who worked alongside them. But it also included those who were actively engaged in politics outside of the traditional establishments. The organisers, the rioters, the philanthropists or academics. I'm going to follow Locksley here, and also try to smooth over some of the gaps of our knowledge. So we know that there were two broad camps that these politically enfranchised sorted themselves into. The first was the moderates, who existed most comfortably within the systems of government at that time. Though there existed some political diversity amongst the moderates, they easily unified themselves through thinking that the systems of government and the economy were broadly just okay. They wanted to tinker with the system to streamline it, to improve it, but they thought that the numerous establishments around them, whether that mean Westminster or the councils or the monarchy or the military, these were all fine. But as the decades passed since the start of the 21st millennia, they had an increasingly hard time holding on to this position. They were a smaller group than their opposition, and they had to contend with the fact that as systems failed or disasters rocked the nation, it was far easier to rally against the system than to defend it. Which leads us to the second group, the radicals. This was where those who had little of a foothold within the system operated, and it was an extremely broad coalition of agitators who thought that the United Kingdom, as it currently operated, was simply not sustainable. Any of the aforementioned institutions were responsible for the decline of the nation, and a new and better way of doing things was necessary. Whilst they broadly had more members than the moderates, the radicals would always struggle with the fact that they were less organised, with less funding, and that they could never quite agree on what exactly they needed to do. Now, what made politics in this era so hard for us to follow was that many of the moderates cloaked themselves in the language of the radicals, and many of the radicals sat and worked with the moderates, either out of necessity or a misguided sense of camaraderie. So, trying to sort out exactly who belongs where is a fairly thankless task. I unfortunately don't have time to go through everything, so this will have to do. At this point, I think it's worth taking a quick detour to talk about one of the most famous aspects of the pre-apocalypse world, the Great Cities, which means I can talk about the capital of the Isles, London. Because, yeah, of course, it's quite easy for us to miss, but this was a time when London wasn't just there, it was alive. Before most of it was abandoned, the city was the centre of political and cultural life for the Isles. From scraps of contemporary writing and census data, it has been estimated that almost 16 million people lived in London alone. It defies one's imagination to cast the empty grey shells of its skyline as anything other than tombstones, but it's true, they housed hundreds of thousands of people from day to night. In Atomic Crown, Locksley devotes a chapter to paint an astonishingly vivid image of a typical London day. He lays out in painstaking detail the logistics that were required to just keep it running for a single day. It was a place of ceaseless movements on its railways, on its motorways, on its airports. thousands of cars and planes and trains in and out with a constant, endless motion. And that was not just on busy days, not just for special occasions or celebrations. That was all the time, every day of the week, all year. Imagine how much physical material that takes. Just try to imagine all the fuel burned and the material being carried, all part of that singular engine of consumption. Just imagine the stadiums of London held tens of thousands, loud enough that you could hear the din of the crowd from miles away, and you could only imagine the hectic energy that would erupt when those same crowds then spilled out into the streets. Imagine the centre of the city, a hub not only for native citizens, but tens of thousands of travellers who came from far and wide to witness it for just a day or two, all of whom walked in the shadows of buildings that scraped against the sky. Imagine Westminster, which had functioned as the nucleus of political power for centuries, and how vast in scale the decisions made there must have been. Scores of people lived in London. They were born and died within its limits, and could have lived entire lives without seeing the true extent of their home. They could have never needed to travel elsewhere, because it would have appeared that the whole world rotated around its axis. Everything you could want, everything you could need could be found there, somewhere. Stand at the top of its tallest tower, and all you would have seen was the city, stretching out until the horizon and beyond, bleeding light enough to blot out the stars. It is no small wonder that capturing this, the lost city, has been one of the great romantic and artistic endeavours of our age. All of the great cities, not just London, were centres of political life, and they were crucially the homes of the radicals. It was here that all the notable upheavals of the century began, where new ideas for the nation were synthesised, where the youth found new dreams for the future, and where they were fought for on the streets. To talk with someone from one of the great cities, the suggestion that they could be abandoned was almost laughable. The metropolis was implacable. London, the United Kingdom, the Crown, none of these could die or be killed. To the pre-war world, there were certain ideas that were immutable. There was no reason to challenge these things, because they had already been set in stone by past generations. Admittedly, I could talk about the broad ideas of the pre-war world for hours on end, and it would be interesting, but we need to begin looking at the people and events that came to define the tense period leading up to the war itself, so that we can have all our players in position for it to begin. What this really means is that I now have to explain the Rotten system to you, which is a whole can of worms that is first going to take explaining the late 2020s. The first and most essential piece of information to impress upon you would be that there had been a long period of political prominence by a smattering of radical groups during the 2020s. Though they were myriad and often contradictory in their stances with each other, they were all relatively unified in their dislike for the current system. Their previous attempts to peacefully enter power had been repeatedly and forcefully denied, and so they had taken a decidedly more confrontational stance in both rhetoric and action. In what would come to be known as the wildfire years, which began sometime around 2028, attempts to outmaneuver the state and engineer its downfall manifested in a number of explosive and spontaneous eruptions of anger. Much of this action was surprisingly directionless and emotional, because although it was fueled by a leadership of ambitious men and women, a large portion of them had no goals beyond the furthering of their own popularity. It is a great irony that many of the later leaders of the 2030s found their following in the more radical 2020s, but would effectively abandon their following in the coming repressions. Men such as Peter Newfield, Miles Rosdale, and Chidi Nnamdi were all found on the front lines of the action before they metamorphosed into career politicians, and then they helped to bar their former comrades from getting the same access. As such, although they would often manage to seize control of the zeitgeist for days or weeks at a time, when the question came of how they would push their goals or what exactly their goals should be, the movements would splinter time and time again. A number of the romantic interpretations of the pre-war period are intrinsically linked to the events of these years. The rather gushingly named Flowering of London was named for a 3-week period in which the city was brought to halt during the summer of 2028 by mass protest. There was the bullet that shocked the nation when Chancellor Annika Barnes was shot and killed during the first Sykes cabinet in late 2029. And finally, the breaking of the rivers is somewhat of a modern founding myth for many of the more northern states and cities due to the outpouring of anger following massive floods. Although I will suggest a bit of caution when trying to look into this event, as it is admittedly often quite exaggerated. The romanticism for this era is far removed from the reality, which is that the broad majority of radicals, who were outside of the leadership, supported these events out of fear for the future of themselves and their friends and families, and so acted without much keen strategic planning or ideological tendency. But the wildfire years and the broader radical era were brought to a grinding halt by the start of the 2030s. A calculated backlash was forming within the ranks of the moderates, who held all members of the radicals with a deep-seated contempt. What began as an attempt to seize control of the narrative from their opposition quickly spiraled into a wide-ranging conspiracy to stamp out all traces of the movement that was challenging their position. When it finally kicked into motion, it became one of the defining events of the 2030s. We now know them as the Blackout Weeks, and they occurred in the autumn of 2032. Although this was only the first of many waves of repression targeting the radicals, it is one that remained most seared into the consciousness of the pre-war generation. After forcibly disconnecting many of the nation's communication networks, the entrenched moderates beheaded much of the radical movement through targeted removals, arrests, and dissolutions, whilst also introducing packaged reforms to the political system and media environment to ensure that radical voices would be consigned to the farthest fringes of society. These reforms were marketed as a series of concessions, an astonishing piece of marketing that worked only through the subsuming of formerly radical leaders who denounced their colleagues and effectively joined the ranks of the moderates. The large sections of the population who existed outside of both radical and moderate spheres would broadly come to support this action because many of them fully believed it was a victory for the radicals. Some happy compromise that would tie a neat bow on the wildfire years, and they would never come to terms with the fact that it had instead been one of the most shocking political purges in the history of the United Kingdom. With the Blackout Weeks, the era of radicalism had ended definitively. But what was to come next? Though they had papered over the cracks with their so-called reforms, there wasn't really any plan for the future from the moderates. The legislature and political circles around it had been rendered a closed system, starved of both oxygen and life. Radical ideas were considered implausible at best and traitorous at worst. Without a plan for the future, or the pressure of the radicals to force change upon the system, the political system slipped into petty internal conflicts in which the systems set up for the sake of targeting the radicals were instead used to police their fellow moderates. The distinctions between parties had become so meaningless that personalistic following was practically the only real difference left, and so new parties would form and merge and rise and fall depending on the ego of the politicians of the day. Around these parties were the cabals of special advisors who held no real official role within government, yet had been critical to the execution of the Blackout Weeks, and so had dug their heels into the levers of power and refused to be removed. There was also the representative of certain corporate interests, many of whom had funded the defections of key radical leadership, and who now demanded that the political class effectively surrender further portions of the government to their conglomerates. And, whilst they won't receive much of a spotlight this week, it will be critical to know that these interests existed for our next episode. In totality, all of this together was the rotten system, a term which was coined not by its opponents, but by the politicians who had to work within it, many of whom were absolutely miserable and resented the constraints it had created, yet would absolutely take no action to undo it. It was described by one anonymous member of parliament as if we are helping the maggots clean a carcass, this whole rotten system. At this point, the first player who really steps into centre stage has already been mentioned, but he really is about to play one of the most important roles in the history of the United Kingdom. I, of course, could only be talking about one man, the so-called clown king of the rotten system, Peter Newfield. Born in 1989, we don't know much about Newfield's early life, other than the fact he was born in the city of Bath and had what could be described as a relatively uneventful childhood. His father had been an entrepreneur and although he had started in relative poverty, had come to carve out a small niche in the coming technological boom of the late 20th century. This afforded Peter the comfort and choice of a life towards the higher echelons of society in the United Kingdom, although it stopped just short of affording him a position at one of the prestigious schools that would all but guarantee your place in the highest echelon. The enduring myth of his father's success, which was constantly trumpeted by both his opponents and his supporters, would come to have a profound effect on Newfield's personal and political outlook. It ingrained not only the necessity of building his own future, but also the idea he was capable of doing it at all. He would constantly discuss the idea of his own success with any who would listen, and it would constantly be measured against the milestones of his own father's life. So, when he neither succeeded nor failed at his education, it drove him away from the traditional routes and into the burgeoning radical movement. It was here that Newfield began to demonstrate the skills that would earn him the ability to survive and thrive. The most important of these skills was his inability to truly marry himself to any one movement, whilst convincing those involved that he was devoted to its cause. Newfield's history is littered with roles in differing political organisations, ones which really would have no business accepting a man who had just months ago been involved with his rivals. Yet, his duplicity was somehow, inexplicably, seen as endearing more than it was lacking. It was partially attributed to his charisma, as Newfield certainly had the ability to charm people, but it was not a stereotypical charm that he exhibited. Rather, with an uncanny ability to perform without appearing pathetic, and by making himself the butt of every joke, every criticism seemed only to play into the Peter Newfield that everyone knew and also loved. At a time when politicians were broadly seen as a laughingstock anyway, Punching Bag Pete managed to play it for the audience. Newfield's attachment to the radical cause is hard to pin down exactly, as he still moved around the myriad organisations within it for the longest time. But a flirtation with the movement at university blossomed into a full-time love affair when the 2020s came into view. Having come into the workforce around the time of a massive financial catastrophe, and then experiencing later shocks through political upheaval and global pandemic, he certainly had little to lose by attaching himself to these causes. He would describe himself in a speech during the later 2030s as having enjoyed their company but seen fatal flaws in the organisation and ideas of the movement, which really raises the question of what Newfield saw in the radical movement. The most convincing theory I've seen is found once again in the pages of Locksley's Atomic Crown, in which Locksley described how Newfield had little love for the radicals that he surrounded himself with, but an even greater loathing for some of his perceived enemies within the moderates, the people who he described as being unable to make their own way and drunk on money they never deserved. Personal vendetta gave him a purpose that ideological leaning did not. The radical movement did give Newfield one thing that was absolutely vital to his future success, however, and that was a seat in Parliament, with Peter getting elected in the seat of Frome and East Somerset in 2027. Without this, it is certain that his later attempts to reach out to the moderate movement in 2031 would have been entirely ignored, and he would have almost certainly have been swept up in the coming blackout weeks. When exactly Peter abandoned the movement is something we won't ever be able to know for sure. Yet, when the time came, he abandoned the radical movement as easily as one changes clothes. When the country emerged from the paralysed communication of the blackout, he worked tirelessly as the spokesperson for the so-called readmitted radicals, reshaping and reforging their image to fit in smoothly with the moderate programme. This is where Newfield moves from a background character to a central figure within the United Kingdom. Now, to dodge the question of the alignment of political parties and the other MPs who would come to power and then ruin within the rotten system, Newfield continually managed to move up the rungs of the rotten system by defecting and prostrating himself before the party of the hour. He had built himself a fairly reliable group of fellows around himself, and they had allowed him a place of prominence due to his apparent inability to be brought down by his opponent's attacks. In this period during the 2030s, you can basically chart the ascension of Newfield through the cabinets of the decade, moving from relatively obscure positions to central roles before eventually landing himself the role of Deputy Prime Minister. because the self-proclaimed, self-made man had one singular goal in mind: becoming Prime Minister. Newfield's obsession with the role of Prime Minister had almost certainly been planted by those seeds of doubt about his position in life, the idea of needing to build something for himself. But, as we will see next episode, he didn't care much for the actual processes of the position. The idea of Prime Minister Newfield was so attractive to him that it overrode any concerns he might have had about the rigours and stresses of the work itself. It did also mean that whilst he was talking potential supporters into his camp, he had no qualms about carving up the assigned powers of the role and then the government itself, and dishing them out to ensure that they would be loyal. It certainly worked, as Newfield went from a practical outsider before leading his so-called reorganised radicals into the heart of Westminster. In the 2039 elections, they managed to build a coalition with a small but convincing majority, and he delivered his first speech as Prime Minister at the dawn of 2040. When writing this episode, I reached out to a colleague in the Society of the Lost Son and managed to secure a copy of the transcript of this speech. When I did, they commented that I was about to experience an acute sense of dramatic irony, and boy, was that ever right. In the speech, Newfield talks of the 2040s heralding a new beginning for England, for the Union, and for the world. I don't think he knew just what form that change would take, but in a way he would end up being proved right. Now, in the shadows of Newfield's rise to power was a small but growing cohort of moderate MPs who were disgusted by the whole affair. Fortunately for Newfield, and unfortunately for this cohort, they lacked access to any of the funding or political connections that would really enable them to do anything with this sense of disgust. These were men of insignificant positions within Parliament, backbenchers who occasionally heckled decisions, but were then forced to go along with them. Slowly coming together, through a shared sense of ideology rather than loyalty, this group was an informal connection. They had to move within the jigsaw of random parties that followed the personalities of the days. But although they could not make their own parties, they would make sure to hold get-togethers or meetings on every Wednesday of every month. Naturally, we know them as the Wednesday Group. Because, although most of the moderates and their colleagues had personally benefited from some aspect of the rotten system, it had come at the expense of the nation's institutions and the roles of its MPs. Within the Wednesday Group, we find a number of MPs who detested that the members of Parliament had become mere cheerleaders for their special advisers, their corporate interests, and the colleagues around them. They looked backwards to a number of supposed golden eras, from which they drew their rhetoric. Now, the broad answer to what exactly these men and women looked for was basically anything that wasn't the last 3 decades of British politics. Knowing what exactly the Wednesday groups supported in these earliest days is really hard to tell. There's no real surviving transcripts of their meetings, nor were they keen to discuss them. Many of the men inside the group would later end up killed or overthrown, and so never managed to write their own memoirs. But from their later speeches, we know that they had come to venerate 3 main institutions that they thought should be restored to power: Parliament, the military, and the Crown. They had all certainly rebelled during the blackout weeks, which they had initially thought to have been the military reasserting control over a ruined nation, but were ultimately disappointed when the end result was instead the entrenching of the rotten system. The man to remember here became one of the most passionate members of the Wednesday Group, even as the rest of the world either ignored them or did not know they existed. Caspar Lockridge was born in 1982, making him 62 in 2043, and had come from a family that had traditionally enjoyed the highest privileges. The Lockridge family had dominated their local politics since the time of his great-grandfather, but around the time of the early 2020s, his mother lost her seat during the collapse of the Conservative governments. Her retirement practically ensured that he would have to take up the torch of the Lockridge political dynasty, and he applied himself vigorously to recovering the reputation of both family and party. He was rewarded in the snap election of 2027, although he quickly came to realise the precariousness of his position as the wildfire years rolled across the nation. His career was saved by the collapse of the first Syke cabinet and from the attention of his political mentor, who I won't linger too much on, but was a woman by the name of Vanessa St. Clair. Vanessa had acted as one of the founding members of the Wednesday Group and would personally champion Lockridge to the other members once it became clear that their interests were aligned. Her retirement from politics in 2039, and then from life in 2040, paved the way for Lockridge to take a preeminent role in the group. He had spent much of the 2030s just existing within the Wednesday Group, but by late 2042, Caspar had begun trying to openly push other members of the group to take a more public role in their advancement of the cause, but had been meeting stiff resistance. Opposing elements of the rotten system, that was a given, but putting that into practice, well, that was a much riskier affair. It would almost certainly put you on the receiving end of countless attacks from the reformed institutions that enabled it to exist, and might even lead you to being disbarred from being a member of parliament. Atomic Crown has a very interesting little extract from a diary that Caspar had recorded, and it illustrates that he had almost decided to throw the towel in. The immense time, effort, and money he had put into the Wednesday Group had resulted in little, if any, change, and he had broadly appeared pretty miserable with the entire endeavour. He refers to several key members as honourable attendance of dinner, before commenting that he would give it just one more year. Just 1 year, and Lockridge might not have had any part to play in the coming storm. But we all know that's not what happens. As we hurtle towards the fateful July date in 2043, I'll finish by commenting on what had happened to the remnants of the radical movement during the 2030s. After the blackout weeks, the overtly political elements of the radicals had been forced underground, unable to operate within or around the suffocating influence of the rotten system. Several attempts to reassert themselves into the political foreground were met with apathy and then renewed repression. The radicals could not exist in that space, so began to turn to the areas where the government was effectively blind or, more subtly, reliant on their existence. A series of support networks and also charities had existed for the longest time within the kingdom, and many of them had had a radical slant in their earlier days. But these had slowly been weeded out by a sense that charity somehow should be apolitical. As politicians like Newfield ascended to the front of the political scene, and the rotten system truly began to cannibalise every aspect of the British state, more and more of the basic functions of government either collapsed or relied upon these networks of support. So, as they ballooned in size and became more of a day-to-day necessity for the poorer members of society, so did they become meeting grounds for the surviving radical movement. Here, the next generation of the radicals really began to meet each other and discuss in earnest what they thought they could do. So many of them had grown up and experienced a system that was entirely broken or hostile to their existence, and the repression was only hardening their ability to survive. When we come to the immediate aftermath period, the networks are responsible for some of the most famous partnerships of the day, and the earlier repressions had only made their opposition more hardline. Taking on the characteristics of a stubborn weed, the radicals clung to their existence and would soon find new life. And that's where Atomic Crown pretty much ends. Looking at it now, and imagining that you did not have the knowledge of what was to come, it almost feels anticlimactic. The story was only half complete. We needed to know more about how Peter Newfield might rise and fall. We needed to know what would happen with the Wednesday Group and whether they would ever break through. Would the radicals find a new way to take out the rotten system? But that's it. That is where the story of a united kingdom before the war ends. Everything was about to change. I will see you next episode, when the bombs begin to fall. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, do go support us on Patreon. It's the best and most direct way to ensure that the show can keep going, and you get access to all the episodes without any of the annoying ads. All the tiers get access to the same content, so you can pay as much or as little as you want. Go to patreon.com/LostSunSociety, all one word, or check out the link in the description. I'll see you next episode.